This is Lecture 122B in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies Volume 7, in this case, of your book on Communism in Europe. The title of our lecture this morning is Finland Station to October. Lenin's 1914 to 1915 restudy of Hegel in Bern allowed him to unravel the dialectics of how it had happened that the labor movement had been dialectically transformed into its opposite on the capitalist world war. He already knew what to do about the immediate situation, namely to lead a revolutionary upheaval among the cannon fodder workers and farmers of the world the capitalists had placed in their armies. The philosophical analysis was fundamental, however, to the explication of why turning the world war into a civil war was correct. Now Lenin could return to the mechanics of the task at hand. The Bolsheviks, still underground in Russia, had been busy boring from within. Vyacheslav Molotov and Elena Stasova had made their way back to Russia. The RSDLP-B, that is, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Bolsheviks, was within the factories and the army. The days left for the rotten regime of magnate capitalists and dukedoms of feudal capitalist imperial Russia were few in number. Lenin and his Bolsheviks had the slogan, "Turn the imperialist war into a civil war. Soldiers to shoot their officers, workers to seize the factories, farmers to take the land." The Bolshevik objective was turning the struggle of the workers and farmers onto the road that was in their interest, rather than to continue along the road of capitalist and feudal interests onto which they had been misled. Lenin arranged a railway trip from Switzerland through Germany to Russia with his agents in Berlin. These men had been working together in Berlin on behalf of Lenin and the German General Army Staff. When Lenin's supposedly sealed train reached Berlin, it was sidetracked long enough for him to meet with the General Staff. That meeting was secret, and although there may be a transcript in someone's possession of the conversation, I've never been able to find it. What we do know is that Lenin made his usual pitch, that is, he would get Russia out of the war if he got back. Now remember that the Germans had been secretly funding Lenin off and on for a long time, playing the long game. Now the Tsar was gone, and Lenin had gotten this far in the month that had passed since Nicholas's overthrow. It was a great opportunity for the Wehrmacht General Staff to win on their eastern front and shift their resources to defeat the UK and France on the western front. The generals were chomping at the bit when they met with Lenin, as anxious as he was to get the thing done. And so it was. Lenin went back to his rail car with a bag of cash, and more was being sent to Petrograd, that is St. Petersburg, by bank wire even before he left Berlin. Meanwhile, when the overthrow came on 23 February of 1917, Stalin had been sitting in the Achinsk railroad station on the Siberian Railroad awaiting permission from the secret police to go to Krasnoyarsk. There he had run into Vera Schweitzer, whose husband had been murdered by the Okhrana while in exile. She wanted an escort to St. Petersburg, and she liked Koba. They traveled together the rest of the way. Now Stalin wanted to be closer to his destination of St. Petersburg and expected to get permission soon to move on to Krasnoyarsk. However, then the Tsarist regime just collapsed. It was no more. There was no one to grant or deny permission. Stalin got on the next train west, and the two of them took 4 days getting back. When he arrived in that city on 26 February 1917, he detrained with his friend Vera Schweitzer. He was carrying a typewriter, and the two of them walked down the boulevard to the Kashinskaya mansion where the Bolsheviks had set up their national headquarters. Vyacheslav Molotov, Elena Stasova, and Alexander Shlapnikov were working when these two walked in. They turned everything over to Stalin when he arrived, and Stalin was then the most senior Central Committee member in town. Stalin's job was to prepare for the return of the boss by getting the party organization back together and handling the incoming funds. The next day, Lev Kamenev arrived and became Stalin's deputy. The two of them took their seats in the Petrograd City Council chambers that were also located in this mansion of one of the Tsar's former mistresses. The next day, Stalin went to the home of an old friend, Sergei Aliyeva. In the midst of regaling each other with tales of Siberia in exile and Russia in revolution, Sergei's daughter, Nadia, returned home from her spring break. She had fond memories of Uncle Koba, who was 20 years her senior and had saved her from drowning at Baku while they had been at the beach. She said at some point, "I finished high school in May. Do you think I could get a job working for the party secretarial pool?" Stalin had said, "Certainly, you can plan on that, depending on the vagaries of history and if the party is still alive." Who could know that within a year the two of them would be married? Anyway, concerning the party press, Stalin was doing what Lenin said the Bolshevik party should have been doing in his absence. Lenin understood the importance of the Stalin retreat activity of all of his men on the spot, including those who had appeared to have been collaborating. Some would have to participate in the various forums, as dialogue had to go on with full Bolshevik participation as far as the press and the public were concerned. That meant taking whatever positions one had to take to stay to the left but not too far, until the boss got back. For the moment, Stalin in charge of paying the cadre and funding and running the party press, and he was at his old job of secret financial resource identification that now included the incoming German marks via bank wire. When Lenin did arrive, he instructed Koba to keep doing all those things that he had been doing all along for at least 17 years, as we have just reviewed. Stalin was a man proven in his ability and therefore profoundly capable of handling the great secret tasks waiting. Therefore, it is easy to see why Lenin handed Stalin the formal responsibility of heading up the party's secret department. Stalin had always, from the beginning and for many years, been the chief of secret operations, at least to the degree that he could be. During incarcerations, he was often temporarily out of action, and his Caucasus mentor and next in command, Leonid Garrison, would take over. When word got to them that Lenin had arrived in Finland, there was jubilation and anxiety. The Russians had worked out the mechanics for the seizure of state power in the 1905 revolution. Councils called Soviets in Russian had been established in St. Petersburg in that year, as well as in cities and administrative units throughout the empire. These councils, or Soviets, were the then contemporary recreation of the Commune of revolutionary Paris and part of the program of the working-class government for all of France in 1871. The job in Russia and its empire in 1917 was to re-establish these councils, or Soviets, and to put armed force, that is the state, in their hands. It was the job of the Bolshevik Party and its cadre to see that new councils, or Soviets, were formed as soon as possible everywhere, and to plan to take all power as soon as possible in their name. The Paris Commune model was about to be replaced by our new Leninist model. However, the way this was to be done was not clear to anyone but Lenin and Stalin. Lenin sent the telegraphic message for Stalin to meet his train before it arrived in Russia's Finland station, somewhere in Finland. Other Bolshevik leaders who had been wavering on the issue of the party press had a sudden tinge in the abdomen. Lenin's German money. In February of 1917, hungry people led by the working women of the city rose against the Tsar in Petrograd, which was the Tsar's wartime name for St. Petersburg, the city that was to be named after Lenin. Bourgeois leaders, unhappy the Tsar had proven unable to do anything except kill large numbers of workers and farmers through his military incompetence, seized upon the working people's uprising. They had overthrown the magnate ducal regime and replaced it with a capitalist provisional government. This government had now made the serious mistake of allowing all political exiles amnesty and the right to return. Given the demand of the masses, it had no choice anyway. Now, after the return of Stalin et al., it was Lenin's return that everyone was waiting for, and now Lenin's train was nearing the gates of the city. And he was arriving at Petrograd with plenty of cash and more on the way, being bank wired from Germany to Sweden to Finland. Stalin had assigned a small army of financial agents to physically assist in handling the transfers. Now Lenin was ready to kick some ass. Before this was all over, Lenin would get at least 50 million gold rubles from the Germans. Lenin wasn't naive about money, nor about the class enemies he confronted, nor anything else. He still had to learn about that undiscovered country of selfish and sadistic basal imprinting. Why? Because it was as strong in the oppressed classes as it was in the masters and mistresses and the boss hierarchy of society, a common deficiency in all Marxists at that time, and many to this very day. Stalin briefed Lenin on the train as to how the money situation was being handled. The two of them then detrained in Petrograd together. Lenin immediately began preaching revolution against the capitalist provisional government, first on the platform of the Finland station, just after stepping off the train. There, hundreds of thousands of workers and their families, along with deputations of soldiers and sailors, and an honor guard from one of the previously Tsarist ships in port, formed a tumultuous crowd, greeting their hero. It was the biggest reception of any leader coming home from a foreign land in the months after February and before October of 1917. Suffice it to say that Lenin found his own Bolsheviks collaborating with the enemy provisional government that was bourgeois to the core, with a smattering of right-wing respectable socialists of one stripe or another. What they, the workers and their party, the Bolshevik Party, should have been doing instead, Lenin said, was to be preparing to strike out and destroy the bourgeois regime. He went directly to the workers of the Petrograd City Council, or Soviet, explaining to them their historic task, and with their enthusiastic support, he was able to rearm the party. His control over the funds needed to publish all the new Bolshevik newspapers and pay the entire new cadre did not hurt either. From April to July, the party rearmed. The party was rearmed in April 1917 by the document we know as the April Thesis. Lenin enumerated 10 principal commandments as the 10 Theses of April. These 10 Theses were popularly referred to as the Bolshevik 10 Commandments. 1. End the imperialist war. 2. All political and governmental power was to be transferred to the councils, that is, the Soviets. 3. Overthrow the capitalist provisional government. 4. Use the councils, or Soviets, to form the new government. 5. The new government to be A. Government of working committees, that is, councils at every level, with B. The army disbanded and replaced with a red armed military force, and C. Government official salaries to be no more than those of unionized workers, and D. Election and immediate recall of all government officials. Commandment 6 was all the land to be transferred to those that formed it, and number 7, all the capitalist banks to be seized and made into one people's bank. Number 8, establish social justice now but not socialism. 9, call an immediate Bolshevik Party Congress to A, bring the party up to date on key issues, and B, change the name to Communist Party. And 10, call a new Third International of Working People. All of this published in Pravda on April 7, 1917. Seizing state power. Lenin hammered the party into seizing power in October through letters and demands. By July 1917, he was again in hiding from the capitalist secret police. Only Stalin knew where he was, having been assigned this role of protecting the maximum leader by the seizure committee, that is, the original Politburo, and Lenin ordered them to study the manuscript of his book, State and Revolution. There, Lenin had begun with Engels' The Origin of the State, Private Property, and the Family. He did this to make his point, that as Engels said, to paraphrase, quote, the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms and arises in the hands of those who can pay their thugs to suppress the masses. This means that the Bolsheviks now have to seize state power from the class enemy. We must build our own state and establish a proletarian dictatorship over the enemy. In so doing, we can then proceed to construct the socialist world order, unquote. Lenin said, quote, the proletarian state is a machine for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Such suppression is necessary because the furious, desperate resistance put up by the landowners and capitalists, by the entire bourgeoisie, and all their hangers-on, by all the exploiters who stop at nothing when their overthrow, when the expropriation of the expropriators begins. That's all from the Letters of the Workers of Europe and America, published in Pravda on January 24, 1919. Understanding the state. Lenin's correct understanding of the nature of the state, any state, is the key to our understanding Lenin's success in introducing the stage of Stalinist socialism onto the world historical stage. Every state, including the most democratic republic is nothing but a machine for the suppression of one class by another, unquote, as Lenin put it 15 months later in his letter to the workers of Europe and America, published in Pravda on January 24, 1919. He knew he had to overthrow the bourgeois government. The time had come to do it. The first reason Lenin had to act was the scientific conclusion mandated by the correct general theory of historical materialism. He had Engels' summation of Marx's work on state origins to quote directly to prove his point, as I just cited above in The Origin of the Family, Private Properties of the State, published by Frederick Engels in 1888. Now we have my study in 6 volumes that archaeologically confirms that prehistoric emergence of classes in the state happened exactly as a product of the class division of society, where exploiter ranks had become exploiting classes. These classes would have both the need and the financial ability to use thuggery, army and police power, to establish and then enforce their dictatorship. The second reason Lenin determined to act what he did was a tactical matter that required audacity to do what theory tells you to do because the time is ripe. The capitalist regime was weak. The Bolsheviks had just won the elections. There was no reason to wait any longer, and every reason to act before the enemy got a chance to put some bullshit parliamentary system into effect, a system the bourgeoisie would, of course, dominate. From July 3rd to October 3rd, 1917. Sometime in late June of 1917, Leon Trotsky was brought on board the Bolshevik Party and into the leadership. During June, he pranced on the stage of the modern circus to the delight of the great unwashed, who loved his dancing bear routine and were the rabble quite willing to be roused with fiery rhetoric. At his day job in the Petrograd City Council, or Soviet, Trotsky did the same thing. His talk, combined with the clear Leninist hardline being taken in all of Stalin's press, led the mass of Petrograd workers, soldiers, and sailors to believe that armed insurrection, just as soon as possible, was the Bolshevik practical program. This was the reason Lenin decided to ignore Trotsky's 15-year-long history of anti-Bolshevism. It was better to bring him in if possible than to have to fight him in the Petrograd Soviet. And after angry discussions, Trotsky was finally convinced to join the Bolsheviks on their own terms. On the 3rd of July 1917, the pot boiled over and things got really out of hand. Now, at that moment, the boss was on medical leave in Finland. Lenin was having one of his early hypertension episodes. In retrospect, it had all the signs of cerebral arterial sclerosis. Anyway, he had been so sick his colleagues had insisted on this medical leave. Therefore, the only man who could give the order to rise was not in Petrograd. Stalin was asked on the 3rd of July 1917 by sailors at Kronstadt if they should bring their weapons to the demonstration beginning that morning, and he said yes. However, he said it in such a way as to avoid the question as to whether there would be a party order to rise against the capitalist provisional government that day. Why? Because he did not know. The problem was that the boss was in Finland. No one else could give the order. Despite this, the Bolshevik Military Organization, or BMO, went ahead and gave the order anyway. This BMO claimed the support of 60,000 armed soldiers. However, in their own actual hands, they had only Stalin's Red Guard battle groups. Now, this situation changed in a few weeks when Kerensky, the capitalist president of the provisional government, had insufficient loyal troops remaining to stop the advance of the military golpista, that is, couist, General Kornilov. Kornilov would soon be marching from Moscow on Petrograd with the stated objective of slaughtering workers and all the members of the provisional government. President Kerensky would then have to open up the military arsenals and arm the Bolsheviks. When he did, the Bolsheviks stopped Kornilov cold and he went on the run. Kornilov was captured and killed in Siberia. At any rate, this arms distribution by the Bolsheviks in Petrograd gave the BMO what they would need in their second, October 1917 uprising to avoid another defeat like what they were about to suffer on 3 July. In the meantime, the government and Petrograd City Council had moved to the Taurida Palace, to get away from the Bolsheviks at the Kashinskaya mansion. By July 4th of 1917, 100,000 soldiers, sailors, and workers had surrounded the Taurida Palace that housed the capital's provisional government and the Petrograd City Council, or Soviet. They were demanding that the Soviet take all power into its own hands. The Georgia-originating Bolshevik leaders of the Petrograd Soviet refused and dawdled. Lenin arrived in the morning of July 4th, mad as hell. Quote, "You should be thrashed for this," unquote, he said to the leaders of the BMO. It was too late to advance or retreat. It was a fucking mess. Lenin knew the time for a national uprising had not yet come, although it soon would. At this precise moment, the Soviet in Petrograd, and in virtually all the other cities, was comprised of a majority of non-Bolsheviks. None of them had sufficient confidence to take power on their own, but all of them were determined to prevent any of them, especially the Bolsheviks, from doing so. The uprising began to dissipate when the Menshevik-led Soviet refusal to take power, and the Bolshevik leaders, Lenin and Stalin, refused to give the order for the Bolshevik Party to move for all power by itself. The Cap government was confronting a series of escalating contradictions, or crises, which Lenin knew it could not and would not be able to handle to the satisfaction of a rapidly growing number of pissed-off Russians, not to mention the other already revolting nationalities in Georgia, the Ukraine, and Finland. At this point, science told us that revolution was definitely on the agenda, and soon, but the timing required a plan and artistic leadership. This early July mass demonstration of workers, soldiers, and sailors in Petrograd was not the time for a national uprising to overthrow capitalism. Lenin said that what was going on should be considered a dress rehearsal, and so it was. While Trotsky was performing his dancing bear routine at the modern circus and in the Taurida Palace Soviet, Stalin was busy administering the day-to-day affairs of the party, because much of the time Lenin was on medical leave in Finland. And specifically, Stalin had to meet a weekly payroll of 500,000 rubles. That could not come from bank robberies and other expropriations, but would have to come from Germans as per Lenin's Berlin Agreement, and it was coming. But bank wires of that size, frequency, and number could not help but be detected by the capitalist police, who understood everything when it came to money and getting their hands on it. Stalin was also the editor, or in charge of the entire Bolshevik newspaper and magazine complex, and he had to make decisions about which party cadre were to be assigned different tasks nationwide. Now for a moment, let's take a look at the issue of agriculture. The Bolsheviks did not propose the immediate collectivization of agriculture. They had only a tiny base among the farming masses and could not do anything in the countryside anyway. Of course, they wanted to end private property everywhere, including in land, but in practice they decided to pursue a policy of simply letting the farmers take the land as their private property. The farmers were doing it anyway, seizing the vast private estates and dividing it up among themselves. Despite a few Bolshevik government declarations to the contrary, when the time came, the Bolsheviks accepted what the farmers had done spontaneously and accommodated themselves to it, demanding only the surrender of grain and whatever else might be needed, as needed, and this policy was often referred to as war communism. This Bolshevik policy enraged the Socialist Revolutionary Party leaders. That was the major farmers' party. They had their own crackpot pie-in-the-sky formula for agriculture that did not feature small farmers as independent proprietors. Their end came soon as Chekists, that is, Bolshevik police, executed them after their attempt to assassinate Lenin in 1918. 2 pistol shots did enter Lenin's brain, and it was a difficult sea to navigate in those days, and such out-of-touch with reality spokespeople as Rosa Luxemburg criticized the Russian Bolsheviks severely for their failure to collectivize the farmer immediately. In Germany, she and her followers would soon isolate themselves from the farming masses, and this would be their undoing. She was the one person you could always count on getting it wrong. She said, quote, "The Leninist agrarian reform has created a new and powerful layer of popular enemies of socialism in the countryside. enemies whose resistance will be much more dangerous and stubborn than that of the noble large landowners." Unquote. In any event, 1918 would be the Bolsheviks' toughest year. Lenin's decision for agriculture was a stroke of genius, namely to let the ignorant Russian peasant mass of 100 million totally illiterate and uneducated Neolithic-level farmers who were terribly unproductive do as they would with the land as long as they supported our government. You couldn't do anything with these people anyway, not until their level of cultural achievement, in this case culture meaning education, had prepared them to be more than farm animals. And it's exactly as farm animals these Neolithic farmers had been raised by their masters and mistresses under one sadistic dictator or czar after another over the previous several centuries. Had Luxemburg used a little common sense, she would not have found the newly formed, in autumn of 1918, German Communist Party isolated from the farming masses and farm-originating workers. All these newly liberated Russian farm animals, come capitalist farmers, cared about was getting land of their own and raising and selling their crops and animal products on the only kind of market they knew about, the countryside capitalist marketplace. Lenin let that go with the caveat, to paraphrase, that, quote, "the farmers have to have capitalism to survive and produce for now. However, they do not have to have SR and Bolshevik propaganda to survive and produce, so we have had to, or soon will have to, liquidate this bourgeois press permanently." Unquote. Luxemburg failed to realize that the German farmers of middle and lower ranks, as well as her landless farmers and agricultural workers, were not much different from Russian farmers and landless workers. She should have learned from the Bolshevik experience to handle the farming masses carefully, because when bison stampede the race of the humans, white or Indian, the Lone Ranger or Tonto in front of them is irrelevant. Luxemburg failed to recognize the intense nature of the peasant desire to be a capitalist farmer. For millennia, these oppressed, essentially Neolithic farmers had believed if they could just own a piece of their own land, then the world would be perfect. It would take time, experience, and education to guide them in a better collective direction. For this failure to understand the real world, Luxemburg paid with her life. Conversely, the Russian Bolsheviks had avoided precisely this conundrum simply by being very non-naive, or by being, in other words, real-world cognizant, and doing what common sense dictated, if you wanted the soldiers and the food to fight and win a great civil war. Of the principal leaders, it would be Trotsky who would be the first to recognize that Lenin's decision to let the farmers go ahead and do as they would with the land of the aristocrats, the rich farmers, and their church had been fortuitous. It had made all the difference in the civil war in Russia that was 90% small farmer. One must assume Lenin saw the same advantage that lay in the motive ascribed to him by the SR leaders. They believed Lenin saw that the newly propertied small capitalist farmers would find it absolutely necessary to take up arms and fight to hold on to their newly gained land, and therefore would be obvious recruits for the Bolsheviks' new Red Army. It was that party and its army, after all, which had given them legal title to the land. It was legal as far as they were concerned, and the Bolshevik government proclamations had been in support of their seizures. Lenin saying, to paraphrase, quote, "the farmers are going to do it, take the land anyway, so we might as well go along with them for now," unquote. This decision of Lenin's had given the Bolsheviks the support the conscript farmer soldiers they had to have to win the Civil War, and the food to feed them. Trotsky, in the winter of 1919 to 1920, working among farmers of the Urals, went on to advocate the reintroduction of a market economy and the elimination of war communism, which meant forced collection of grain and the issuing of IOUs as soon as possible. Otherwise, we Bolsheviks are going to lose the farmers, and they are 90% of the country. It would take Lenin another full year to agree. For a real flavor for what the Bolsheviks confronted among the farming peoples of Russia and the Empire, I recommend my favorite Soviet author, Michael Sholokhov, his Dawn novels, and Quiet Flow the Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, and Harvest on the Dawn tell the story. Now, back to our story. On the 6th of July 1917, Lenin told Stalin to make a deal with the CAP President Kerensky to bring about the surrender of all the Bolshevik armed units and the party headquarters and press without bloodshed, if given the time, and Kerensky agreed. Again, Stalin hid Lenin. During the course of one day on July 6, 1917, Stalin moved Lenin 5 times. Simultaneously, Stalin asked the workers outside Taurida and their military colleagues to end the demonstration and go home. Then he arranged for the Bolshevik machine gun regiment outside the Taurida to go back to their barracks, and he arranged for the Bolshevik garrison at the Peter and Paul fortress to surrender. Next, he organized the surrender of the Bolshevik headquarters at Kashinskaya Palace. In addition, he agreed to the surrender of the Bolshevik press building. As part of the deal, Stalin and other party leaders at Kashinskaya and elsewhere were allowed to walk away. Stalin walked away as the delegated chief of the Bolsheviks. That is, Stalin had been sent by Lenin to deal with the capitalist provisional government, and President Kerensky accepted him in Lenin's absence. Kerensky had given Stalin and the other Bolshevik leaders at Kashinskaya a safe conduct to pass. The CAP government troops did not vandalize Bolshevik property, and eventually their offices and press was returned to them. Stalin changed his working residence from the apartment he shared near the office at Kashinskaya with Vyacheslav Molotov to the as yet unknown to the CAP government new and stylish address of Comrades Alexeyeva. It was here at the Alexeyeva's home where Stalin hid Lenin at the end of the day, 6 July 1917. Stalin kept moving Lenin around Petrograd, as I've said, for 5 times in that one day. Then Lenin waited at the Alexeyeva home for several days until shaved and disguised he could be taken to Finland on the 12th of July 1917. Stalin and Sergei Alexeyeva were his escorts, and they hid him there until October. In the meantime, Trotsky and Kamenev had been arrested elsewhere and hauled off to jail. The Sixth Congress. After his return from depositing Lenin in Finland, Stalin organized the Bolshevik Party's Sixth Congress at the end of July 1917. It was held in secret in Petrograd in an old monastery on Samsonevsky Boulevard. Stalin was now the acting party leader for the nation and for Petrograd, and he gave the main report in the place of Lenin. He was followed on the speaker's podium by Yakov M. Sverdlov, who gave the organizational report and who commented that Stalin had done such a good job his own report would be very short. The Sixth Congress of the Bolshevik Party named Stalin as the chief editor for all of the party press. It also formalized Stalin as head of the Bolshevik delegation at the Petrograd City Council, or Soviet. The Congress announced the listing of Central Committee members with Lenin, of course, number 1, followed by Kamenev, Trotsky, and Stalin. In later years, Trotskyists would try to use this listing to prove that Trotsky was already superior in the party to Stalin. The truth is that since Kamenev and Trotsky had gotten themselves arrested when everyone else had been allowed to walk free in the Kerensky-Stalin deal, the party decided it would be just as well to put their names up front and keep Stalin in a less vulnerable position. Kamenev had been in the doghouse from day one of Lenin's return, as you may recall, and Trotsky, although a very newcomer to Bolshevism, had been prancing around on the stage of the modern circus and in the Soviet, and he had drawn the ire of the CAP leaders upon himself. Putting their names in front of Stalin gave the acting leader a little more flexibility in moving around and getting things ready for the coming season, which would occur on 24 to 26 October 1917. The July 3rd to 6th, 1917 uprising of soldiers, sailors, and workers in Petrograd had been bungled largely by the absence of Lenin, who had been in Finland when the Bolshevik military organization, VMO, started the process. Lenin returned just in time to see how the lack of leadership and the lack of a plan was leading to the dissipation of insurrectional strength and to a counterattack by the capitalist government, which would put everyone on the run. Although the capitalist government of Kerensky made every attempt to find Lenin and kill him, and then to discredit Lenin over his financial ties to the German regime, within days the KAP government faced its own potentially life-ending crises. To save itself, the weak KAP government of President Kerensky had had to turn to the Bolsheviks. Kornilov was the capitalist government general located in Moscow. He was marching on Petrograd with the stated intention of slaughtering the workers and all the Social Democrats, including Mensheviks, like the capitalist President Kerensky himself, not just the Bolsheviks. Confronted with his own imminent collapse, Kerensky turned to Stalin, with whom he had established a personal working relationship, as you will recall, only a few weeks earlier. Stalin told him the Bolsheviks' military organization, or BMO, would save the regime, but could not without arms. Kerensky accordingly had no choice but to arm the workers, who were virtually all Bolsheviks. Overnight, 60,000 rifles and pistols and ammunition were turned over to the Bolshevik Red Guard battle groups, and eventually 250,000 small arms went to them and to the workers of Petrograd and Moscow. Kornilov was defeated and fled to Siberia. There the Bolsheviks eventually caught and killed him. The important thing now was that the Bolsheviks had guns directly in their hands, and the army was coming over to the BMO, at least in the cities, unit by unit, like an avalanche. Stalin finished the process by physically seizing the BMO newspaper Soldier, where he arrested its leaders, bringing many of them to a party trial. He also seized their money and instituted his own new command structure. There would be no more Julys. The writing was on the wall. As October 1917 began, Lenin from Finland was demanding that the party seize state power. Now, to make a long story short, he returned to Petrograd long enough to hammer the leadership into agreement. On 10 October 1917, the meeting for a final solution began close to midnight and continued until nearly dawn of the 11th. 10 top Bolsheviks joined Lenin. Stalin and Trotsky strongly supported his demand to plan for an immediate military uprising of Red forces to seize state power. Only 2 of them voted against Lenin, the 2 gutless wonders, Kamenev and Zinoviev. The seizure committee was selected. It included Stalin and Trotsky, who had joined Lenin and the Bolshevik Party in June, some 3 months earlier, as you will recall. The group then decided to hold a planning meeting in 5 days to review the plans to be drawn up by Stalin and his Central Committee aides in the interim. The seizure committee was the embryo of the concept of a leadership by a Central Committee political bureau. It became known thereafter to the world as the Politburo. The die is cast. The group met as scheduled on the 16th of October 1917 and approved Stalin's plan. Trotsky was absent, working at the Taurida Soviet, where he was now chairman of the Petrograd City Council's Military Revolutionary Committee, or MRC, that had been created on 9 October 1917. Kamenev and Zinoviev again voiced their disagreement, but were out-argued and quickly overcome by Lenin and all the others. The final date was set for October 24, 1917. Stalin said, "The die is cast." His press, all the Bolshevik press, took up that call. Betrayal. On October 18, 1917, Kamenev and Zinoviev betrayed that plan to the KAP press. They were immediately expelled from the party. Fortunately, the KAP press saw their betrayal as a provocation. The fact that Stalin went ahead and published the Kamenev-Zinoviev letter, which explained their opposition ideas, and Robochi put, he and they saw as a downplaying of the idea that the party was preparing a seizure. After all, to the KAPs it did not make sense that the party would publish its antithesis unless Lenin was doing what they thought he had done before in July, that is, threaten but not seriously, testing the water. Again, Stalin says, "The die is cast, be ready." However, confusingly, when Stalin wrote the party's official declaration in Pravda, which was, quote, "The Bolsheviks have issued the call, be ready," unquote, the KAPs were confused, but anyone who wanted to draw the right conclusion could see that indeed the die was cast. The Bolsheviks were going to go for broke. The Red Military Centers. It was decided that since the Petrograd City Council MRC, the Military Revolutionary Committee, was all Bolshevik, the seizure should be undertaken in its name. The party had, by the 24th of October 1917, the loyalty of the Petrograd Army Garrison. Specifically, the Petrograd Army Garrison had voted to take orders only from the MRC, or to take cap government orders only when countersigned by the MRC. Stalin and his Red Guard, Kashinskaya Center, would guard the party installations themselves from cap government counterattack or surprise attack. In the event, the Stalin Center acted first, but in response to the cap first move. Kerensky moves first, gunned down at Trude Press. On 24 October 1917, Kerensky decided to gamble audaciously and move first. He sent cap government loyal troops to seize Stalin's press operations building at dawn. These offices of the Trude Press were then attacked and the machinery vandalized by Kerensky's troops. Stalin immediately retaliated with his Red Guard battle groups. After an OK Corral type of shootout lasting until the afternoon, the building was back in Bolshevik hands. The MRC's Volkhnia Army Regiment arrived shortly thereafter to reinforce the Red Guards and prevent a future assault by Kerensky. This may have been the last time that Stalin and Trotsky fought together in a winner-takes-all campaign. The Bolsheviks moved next. Meanwhile, recognizing that Kerensky's attack had triggered the revolution, second-string leaders were dispatched with Red Guard troops from Stalin centers to seize the railway depots, the post office and telegraph office, the food warehouses, and all the banks. Representatives of the Bolshevik headquarters were dispatched to establish formal relations with the left social revolutionaries, and another contingent was sent to supervise the assault on the cap provisional government, now entrenched at the Petrograd Winter Palace. Still another contingent established constant telephone contact with Bolshevik Party battle groups in Moscow. Bolshevik battle groups in Moscow were simultaneously engaging the Tsarist army and police garrisons in that city. Trotsky's MRC mobilized the army units in Petrograd and naval units at Kronstadt to stand by as they would soon be needed. As it turned out in Petrograd, they were only needed to reinforce the Red Guards. However, in Moscow, Kiev, Kharkov, Minsk, and many other cities, the regular army troops, now under Trotsky's Bolshevik command, would be needed in intense armed conflict with units remaining loyal to the cap government. The proletarian revolution was now underway and would be extremely violent and hard fought over the next several weeks everywhere except in Petrograd, where the Bolsheviks were moving for state power with relative ease. Stalin left the Kashinskaya headquarters, canceled his scheduled appearance at the Polytechnical Institute in order to be at the new Smolny headquarters for the Soviet MR Committee. There, the next step would be to convene the Congress of Soviets with the new all-Bolshevik government fait accompli. The seizure itself. Everyone, including Lenin, made their way to Smolny, and to make an exciting two-day story too short, suffice it to say that by the 26th of October 1917, the Bolsheviks had completed the seizure. They had captured all the ministers of the cap government who had been holed up at the Tsar's Winter Palace, and finally the Bolsheviks had state power. It was the beginning of a new socio-cultural evolutionary stage on the planet Earth. In summary, knowing what had to be done, Lenin had forced his party leadership to resolve to seize power by force of arms. The story of the seizure has been told by participants and direct observers. These include Leon Trotsky in his book The Russian Revolution, John Reed, the North American from Portland, Oregon, who was an observer of these events and who wrote the internationally famous book 10 Days That Shook the World, and Joseph Stalin in his book The October Revolution. First Petrograd and then Moscow and many other cities came under Bolshevik military control. The question then became, can the Bolsheviks retain state power? This was the title of one of Lenin's books of that time, and that brings us to a conclusion of this particular lecture, and we're going to move on next time to Lecture 122C, Bolshevism at War.